Mm. Okay, so we're live. Great.
Great.
Great. Hi, hello. My name is Aleksandra Skowrońska, and I'm super honored to host today our special guest, Patricia Reed. Patricia, so thank you so much for being here with us. And I will tell a bit about you, and then a little bit about the context of our today's meeting. So Patricia Reed is a theorist, artist, and designer based in Berlin. She's co-head of the Critical Inquirer Lab and the Design Academy in Eindhoven. She's also an affiliate researcher in the Antikythera program. Her recent writings have been published in Navigation Beyond Vision Ceremony, Burial of an Undead World, Ki-Realitäten, AI realities, right? The unnamed Glass Bed Journal, The New Normal, and Flux Journal. She co-wrote the Xenofeminist Manifesto as Laboria Cubonics, which was represented by Verso in 2018. Patricia has been awarded an Agent of Change grant in 2023 from the International Architecture Biennale Rotterdam, and a compilation of her works will be released by Holobionte Ediciones in 2024. Will or where? Will. We're waiting.
Will, hopefully. It keeps getting
Hopefully.
2 years
Okay.
delayed now.
Okay, great.
So we hope, we're crossing fingers.
Okay. And our today's talk is a part of the public program of Soft Stories Divine Alteration exhibition by Leilei Wu. The exhibition is on display, the performative space, let's say, it's on display till the 10th of April in Purple Walls in Vienna. And I will tell a bit about the project itself, if I may. So the exhibition and the first solo show by Leilei Wu explores the relationship between faith, technological imaginings, and the strategy of eternal objectification. The starting point for the project was the observation that contemporary technologies become more and more socially fetishized. Furthermore, even agency and autonomy are attributed to them. Technology, especially advanced language models based on machine learning, commonly referred to as artificial intelligence, cease to be seen as tools and begin to exist as separate entities independent of human will. The tendency to place hope in technology, but also to fear its agency, resembles the way divine beings are treated in various belief systems. The popularization of so-called AI is a breakthrough in the described trend, as its actions are not fully understood, yet it becomes an increasingly present element in everyday life and social imagination. And those above observations seem to provide evidence that contemporary, advanced, complex, and beyond the understanding of their audience and user technologies gain new status, dangerously close to the status of divine beings. Such observation can be found in contemporary humanistic discourse, for example, in Benjamin Noyes' writings. He describes it as a mysticism of the object, treated as possessing divine powers, resulting in the inflation of technological objects into something that both terrifies and fascinates, displacing it from history into the realm of the natural or metaphysical. Meanwhile, Andrea Vaccari points out the intensifying theomorphic role of technology, increasingly visible in everyday discourse, where technology is routinely depicted as significant subject with omnipotent capabilities. And the question is, since technology assumes agency and wields power, at least symbolically and imaginatively, what is the role of humans and societies in such configuration? That's a big question. So exactly what's the role of humans in such a configuration? I think our today's talk will try or will become an attempt to answer that, but not only that, that questions. So today we're gonna talk like for around 45 minutes, and then we have time like 15 minutes for our Q&A session. You can ask question in the chat that I will try to moderate. And yeah, I mean, we will ask a general big question to have this wide horizon, but I will start a little bit personal. Let's say, let's risk that. So I wanted to ask about your approach to technology and philosophy. I mean, it seems unique. It blends like this philosophical and artistic approach. So I would like to ask, where does it come from, and what was your motivation to engage with technology in with a such perspective?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me and congratulations on your exhibition.
Thank you.
And I mean, if you wanted to talk, because I think our idea is also to make this conversation as accessible as possible. And you said you're going to start with a personal question, so I'll answer in a personal way because, in fact, I studied painting when I was, this is like decades ago.
Wow.
And was a complete technophobe. Like I hated the computer. I would even like handwrite essays and this kind of thing. And I guess two things happened. First of all, like my generation is the one where we saw the domestication of the internet in the 90s, right? So this was a major shift and a big source of excitement, and a lot of utopian promises were kind of baked into that. And I happened to be, based in Montreal doing my studies there at the time, which was in a process of rebranding itself as a new media city, trying to attract lots of new technology companies in order to boost its economy. So the general environment was very sort of, let's say, exuberant about these new media possibilities. And, it was like a roommate decided to get the internet. I think my mom even had internet before me because I was so sort of reticent. And the minute I went on the first website, like the next day I was teaching myself HTML, because I was just
wow.
this is so cool. So, and at the time as well, you have to understand that we're like graduating bachelors, like you're getting ready for a life of, to be a poor artist or something. And one of the teachers just said, hey, Patricia, figure out something you like, figure out a skill that you like that you can, make a living with. And at that time, there wasn't so many coders, in fact. So this was a great skill, and you could self-teach. I mean, the bar of entry to get jobs at that time was quite low.
And what was the year? Because you said that. What was the year? Because you said that
Oh, this
time.
would have been 99 or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a while ago.
Oh my God, I was 7.
Yeah, it's a while ago. Yeah. So the point being is just kind of even coming from a really reticent background, I guess in a way kind of fell into that hype, that promise, that excitement that sort of emerged, that everyone could have a presence and everyone could write something and publish. And there was also a proliferation of net art at the time, which I was really excited about. So there was a kind of, and there was a excitement around it, and I definitely fell into that excitement, but also learned how to code, and so already had some sort of relationship to digital or front end web programming and stuff like that, which I think it starts to demystify a lot of these things.
Yeah.
Right, as soon as you're starting to make stuff and try to make things work, you really get out of that realm of demystifying a lot of how these things work. And I think even though, of course, there's much more complicated stuff in terms of coding that's necessary now and that much more advanced people do. But it nonetheless, you get a sense of how it works, right? So I didn't really have that. I wasn't really mystified. I was kind of excited about the possibilities, but I was never mystified by the technology. Whereas I think one interesting observation that I've had in terms of the generational shift is that, someone of my generation, if we had a computer in our home at 15 or something, this meant we were changing in the RAM. We were opening that box. We had to put in floppy disks and code. There was not even an operating system, a graphical user interface, right? So you had some different type of interaction whereby a later generation is already ushered into an interface. So there's a lot of, let's say, masterful interface use. where people can like quickly know how things work, but not necessarily always an in-depth idea of like the protocols, the
Yeah,
structure.
what's inside, basically.
Yeah, and the infrastructure is required to make that happen. And
Yeah.
I think that helps also a little bit defetishize, you know, like years ago there was this whole sort of like the digital native obsession, you know, and I was like, well, like it's also the interface generation, like we have to say that as well, right? So those were just some kind of I guess early forays into it, but also these observations of like what did it mean to come of age in internet culture or computational culture without an interface at the very right. And I think that's that serves as a kind of pathway of demystifying a lot of the things.
Yeah, but you were living this digital utopia dream for a moment, a little bit, a little bit.
That's sure. It was, you know, it's the time of cyber feminism. There was the whole promise of rapid decentralization, or rampant decentralization, I should say, sort of some sort of like radical democratic promise built into this decentralized space. The idea of anonymity was really huge, especially with regards to like the history of cyber feminism, right? Like you could just be an avatar and therefore like sex and gender wouldn't be such an important thing. I mean, that really blew up in our face. So there was a lot of these sort of early promises that
And
were
those promises kind of like coming back, but in disguise, let's say. I mean, I'm talking like with this web-free, you know, business, techno bros environment, I would say. I mean, that's my just like observation. It's not in the script though, the question that I have now. But I have the feeling that like there's kind of the loop, that's some narration from the past, or like some kind of disguised, or maybe like had a little bit different form, but they're promising something very similar. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that one thing that I just wanted to say was the demystifying thing is, I think, an important thing. But the other thing is, yeah, the whole the hype that I certainly grew up with, like this is long, like again, a long time ago, really, like the early days, was that it would be this radical democratization, decentralization sort of narration. And of course, the exact opposite has happened, right? It's like getting more and more condensed into like three major companies right now, right?
Yeah.
So we weren't necessarily cognizant of something like the network effects, right? The fact that none of these platforms are interesting until they have a certain threshold of users, you know, so it does produce a different type of economy that it doesn't fit with that old capitalist one where you have a bunch of competition and right? It's like, you know, this is something Evgeny Morozov talks about a lot. It's just like you only need one Instagram or one this, right? And so the problem now, of course, or the structure, but I guess before we give it a moral valence, but the structure of it now is if you were a small company, for instance, developing something, your best chance is to just be bought out by Alpha or something.
Yeah.
So
I use the word eaten. Yeah. I use the word like to be eaten somehow, a bit digested.
Yeah.
Yeah, these metabolic metaphors are somehow useful just for me. Let's be there in the past for like for a moment. Let's stay there. Like especially the beginning of the millennium. We were talking a little bit about that. What do you think? What are the major changes in the overall narratives regarding this like relationship between what's like technology is, but also with the environment and with humanity, culture? Yeah, like what are the biggest tendencies or changes that you can talk about, like coming that are that they started or they changed from the beginning of the millennium, and or this dot-com bubble, let's say, and then and now they're kind of like transformed completely, or not completely, but massively. I mean, the question is about like major shifts that time to nowadays.
Right. Well, I mean, I think obviously the sort of naive glory days of what the internet would be if we're talking about, because I mean, we're also, I think we should also be careful not to, or at least I should be careful to distinguish, the internet isn't technology as such, right? Let's just
Yes.
say that. But it is a very important part of our cultural
Yeah, we can talk about internet itself. No, yeah.
so like the culture of the internet, for instance, that the sort of the hope that was, let's say, installed in the early, Western domestication of it, or like when it exits the military and enters your home, so to speak. Those days are gone, right? Of course, you have all of these discussions now about the amplification of misinformation, the locking down into social echo chambers and so on. So there's a lot of, I think a lot of that, the sort of optimism that went into what could this be, and how will it bring all of these people together? And on one hand, it certainly does that, right? Especially if you're thinking about certain like community structures that are formed online, if you're like a trans kid in rural America or something, and maybe then maybe these communities aren't such a bad thing, right? Like there are people you can reach out to that are experiencing similar things that may not be in your physical proximity of your community. But of course, it has all these other pernicious effects as well. But I think, I mean, for me, the thing that I think is really interesting to look at, and what maybe to shift it more into this kind of philosophical register, to link the two, is to understand, how these ideas are operationalized, right? Because I think we can talk about these echo chambers and we can talk about the structure of social media, but, following this sort of advice of a figure like Gilbert Simondon, like a philosopher of technology, it's really important we understand how these things work, right? Like what is going on. It's not enough to just formulate, let's say, value-based criticism. We need to understand it operationally. And I think what's interesting is when we start looking into the ideals or the concepts that are sort of either explicitly or implicitly baked into the design of technology. And so I think one really nice example, or really clear example that we all experience, because I think we're all quite aware we are in quite a bubble world in our social media ecosystems, is something like that Wendy Chun, a brilliant theorist, writes about as homophily, right? So love of the same, or the idea that birds of a feather flock together, etc. Right? Okay, but this is a sociological assumption that becomes naturalized as a concept that this is just how humans are.
Yeah.
And this gets automated or operationalized through technology. So I think what's really interesting for me is to think about the liaison between sort of conceptual naturalizations, ideas we have about what is just a matter of fact in the world, and how those get taken for granted, and then enter into that regime of automated reproducibility, because they serve as an extension, they serve as a materialization of those very concepts. So I think that's like one really interesting sort of case where we can clearly see this purely sociological thing. We think that's just how humans are, this kind of terrible, these terrible oversimplifications that we think like, it's just the way it is, right? But then it becomes a reality because it gets automated through these kind of technological procedures. So what is the liaison between the concepts we have about the world, our own interhuman interactions, which are obviously deeply problematic, and then how that gets amplified through technological means. And
So
then
yeah, I mean, I like that you like showing this loop, because that was my next comment/question, that so just to sum up, so we have the situation when we have this assumption that becomes the algorithm, or it's mediated to the algorithm, let's say, and the algorithm then it's mediated to reality, and the reality creates next assumptions, and the loop is kind of like going like faster and faster. So my question would be, I mean, how do you think it's, or is even if it's even possible, and if yes, how it's possible to somehow disrupt or reverse that circle?
It's an excellent question, because on the one hand too, right? Like what is one of the central narratives of Silicon Valley culture, right? We're disruptive, they like champ.
So but what does it mean disruptive?
Yeah, and I think you've got like philosophers like Inigo Wilkins, right? Like the philosopher of noise or something, who's cautious about let's say just giving a blanket idea that all we need to do is disrupt this kind of cycle or something, right? Because noise can be both generative, like there's generative disruptions, and then there's just like pernicious disruptions. So we have to, I think, be very we have to apply these ideas in a really context sensitive way. But one way that I've been thinking about it a lot is because if you think about, I mean, a lot of these systems are about, they're like predictive, right? They're making predictions, feeding that back to you. And that is based on something that is, in a kind of logical sense known as induction. So, and all that means is that you base your reasoning of what a future event will be based on past data, right?
Yeah.
So, the famous example, if I'll make a statement that all swans are white because I've never seen a black swan type of thing, right? And of course, that doesn't exist in reality. There are black swans. But in an inductive world, that statement would be true. And so,
and also that database, right? Or data.
Right, like the sort of statistical probabilities that are made or that are, let's say, calculated, I guess, in a machine system. But then, so these are kind of based on structures of probability, based on historical precedent. So I think there's really interesting spaces for the arts in the sense of like, where a lot of artists are questioning, the nature of time. So like, what would it mean to alter past conditions, in a speculative way, rather than speculation only being about the future? What are these kind of speculative past situations that could be modified to introduce something like the improbable, right? Like how would a machine, like how could machinic use of the improbable pan out as a kind of thought experiment? And so I tend to think about it more in terms of this kind of improbable forecasting more so than that disruptive notion, just because, again, for the reasons that I explained. But I think art can be, I think like the field of art is an interesting space to experiment with that improbability in the sense of like what sort of data signals are sensible by a machine, are sensible by humans, right? And if you start modulating those sorts of protocols, like what would those different results be in a sense? So I think it's a bit abstract, but I think that there's a lot of tinkering that could go on in that level, right? Like even going down to the data sets, for instance.
I mean, I really like your comment about art that it can somehow disrupt this linear ways of seeing the future. I'm thinking about Timothy Morton and the quotes from his Dark Ecology that about art, like he says that art is like unthought thoughts from the future, or can lead to like something that's like unthinkable, but then it's something that's possible to be felt, let's say, through this artistic glances.
You said that's a Fred Moten quote?
Yeah, I mean, not exact, but he's.
But it's from Fred Moten. It's just that
it's from Dark Ecology. From the introduction, I would say. I mean, the quote about the art, and it's unthought thoughts from the future. That's his. And it's like very inspiring for me, and that's, I mean, it kind of shows it's like my my methodology, let's say, that I'm trying to apply it when I'm thinking about art in the future together. Just one sentence and whole methodology is done. So efficient, you know. Yeah, so but also he's writing more about environment, but I love how this like more technological approach and this approach that stems from thinking from about ecology, they fit very well together. Yeah, that's so cool.
Well, I think on that point though, I mean, I think that's the moment that we're in right now. You know, when you
Yeah.
said, why are you interested in technology? It's just like, well, you can't not be, because we're
Yes.
embedded in it, right? That's the point
Yeah.
now. It's not like technology isn't just this thing, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I think Yu Kuei had a really nice kind of quote where he's like, it's the becoming organic of the inorganic, right? Like,
Yeah.
so it's no longer separable from ecology. We have to see all of these things in processes of
Together.
interaction
Yeah.
rather than like discrete self-enclosed entities. You know, they're different from a tree, of course, but they're nonetheless part of some sort of continuum, and we
Yeah.
need to understand that in a much more profound way.
But then, I mean, we can talk about that. I mean, think about that in this critical way, of course. But then I have a feeling that I guess we were talking about that, that there's this process of naturalization that I can see that in the language, in the metaphors that we're using, like data lake or even streaming. It's like from the stream, from the river, right? So those entanglements are visible in or present in a language. I mean, that's what I think, or they're kind of embedded, so they seem more organic. But yeah, the question is, and what now? I mean, if this weird this entanglement between what's organic and what's technological that is visible and present in a language, I think it makes some kind of technological solution. It makes people feel that they're more natural or obvious that they are. That's my that's the thing I would think of. So there's less room for critical approach, I would say, because it's so normal, you know. It's like always have been. Yeah.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it's true that there's these kind of, I mean, I think that's also another space where art can intervene. It's just like the descriptions of these things are important. We are creatures that you know traffic in language. We traffic in signs. We traffic in symbols. We traffic in language. We traffic in representations. And these are also what you know give society some sort of like degree of normativity, right? And we can change that normativity, but there's always a kind of artificial norms that are constructed by society or co-constructed by society. So I agree. I mean, I think the way that we choose to describe these entities, the way they get represented back to us, which is also equally problematic, right? I think like right now we're in this, you know, and again, this philosopher I mentioned earlier, Simondon, kind of saw this like, you know, a really long time ago, far before the so-called digital age or something like that. But it was just like this false binary between, or this, it's not false binary, but it's like a reductive binary between techno-pessimism and techno-fetishism, right? It's like they're all sort of, he kind of saw it as related to the same fundamental resentment, which was a kind of prohibition of technology to enter the domain of culture, right? Culture is this and technology is that, right? And it's not a human thing. And his kind of working hypothesis was that as long as we keep those strict separations, then we will only have this kind of resentment that will either end up in this idolatry of the machine or an absolute terror and fear of the machine, right? And so what does it mean to really truly think the socio-technical, right? And or the socio or the technical and the techno-cultural, right? Like to not be able to separate them anymore, just as much as we are collapsing those divisions between nature and culture, right? Like the same needs to sort of happen, at least conceptually, right? And I'm not saying that they're the same thing, but I think conceptually we have to understand it in a continuity or in some kind of feedback dynamic or a metabolic relation, if you want to kind of pull up that metaphor that you used earlier. In order to avoid those pitfalls of like being pro-tech or anti-tech, because it's not particularly helpful as an analytic category, right? Because every sort of just basically confirming certain predispositions. And again, I think with technology, it sounds boring because it'd be much easier if we could just say AI is good or AI is terrible. But it's a real it requires that context sensitivity, right? Because just as you have AI targeting system in Gaza right now, automated real-time targeting with gospel used by the IDF. You also have AI being used for folding proteins and developing new cancer treatments, right? So it's all of that spectrum. And that's what I mean about the context sensitivity, that you can't fall into that good or bad, dichotomy when speaking about that sort of category. And certainly, I think a lot of the representations we have bend towards that fearful category, right? It's well talked about, the whole Hollywood fetish of the singularity and where machines will triumph over the humans. Like these sorts of narratives are quite, they're basically proving Simondon had a pretty good diagnosis of this situation.
Simondon is an answer to everything that we're talking today. I mean, let's try with that. But I have a question. How do like regarding the thing you said, how do you think or how do you feel? So why is there this need to somehow to say like which side are you in terms of technological solutions, like if it's bad or if it's good? Because I feel there is this kind of urge to decide on what side are you. I don't know like where it stems from.
I don't know, that seems like a psychological question almost, right? It's just like, it would be much easier to navigate life if we could just have really easy answers for everything. Or,
yes,
you know
of
what I mean?
course.
It would be much easier. We wouldn't have to have discussions like this. We could just rather eat some nice food and with it, right? But yeah, I don't know. There's obviously a lot of very good analysis that talks about this. I think especially a lot of the like discourses that are trying to seriously engage with the potential and the pitfalls of reappropriation of technology, right? Like what would it mean to redirect these massive infrastructures that are now corporately owned or state enterprises or something like that? What would it mean to repurpose them? I remember a really good article from Alberto Toscano years ago, and again, it feels like a cop-out, but basically the conclusion of his was like, we have to see, maybe this piece of infrastructure is just like inherently wedded to a neoliberal ethos and it cannot be salvaged for different ends, and other technologies could, right? So I think what I think is important personally is to stop using the word solution, right? Not only because of the solutionist diagnosis, right, where essentially it's all about like using technology to solve otherwise social problems, so to speak, without thinking about, what are the sets of conditions that make us think that problem is necessary to find a solution for in the first place, right? There's that question. But you also end up with quite stupid applications. Like I think that's one clear thing that's emerging now with all of these robust capacities. There's still an immense amount of stupidity in terms of like how information or data is used, right? Like you could have this incredibly useful system, instead it's used for targeted advertising, like quite it's quite stupid in a way, right? Or sorry, I lost my train of thought, but yeah,
I mean,
just like, what's that?
we started from the question, the psychological question, and
Yeah, but I think like already if we'd move away from this kind of
mhm,
idea of technology offering a solution, right?
mhm,
And it's more about how do we understand it as both cause and effect?
mhm,
How do we continually like adjust and adapt rather than seeking a panacea from technology, right? I think the critics of technology are often, I think they're ultimately critical of those who think that they can solve the thing through a piece of technology, where technologies could be of service, but it's not the be all and end all. And I think certainly, listen, we have a lot of technological abilities and a lot of and not so much the political will in many cases. And I think we certainly saw that in the COVID-19 experience, right? Whereby we had a very quick we had a vaccine very quickly, like unprecedented, unbelievably quickly, had a kind of solution, if you want, to help navigate this kind of global pandemic. And of course, it gets trapped in the geopolitical game of the global north hoarding the vaccines,
mhm,
not distribution. That was never a technical problem, right? That was like a political economic problem. So that's where we see the limitations and the injustice in terms of application for something like the vaccine distribution, for instance. And that's what I mean about thinking we need to be able to think these two, because it's not enough that look how great we are. We quickly, found a remedy for this virus. But without the
yeah, and
political
what's next?
economic incentive to distribute, like it's
Yeah.
not really, yeah.
And we were talking a little bit about art, how it can be, sorry, I mean, useful. I mean, I don't know if it's is the right word, or how it can be helpful. Um,
Mhm.
so I would like to take with it the
Yeah.
topic. I mean, in terms of like distribution of power, connected with technological development. I'm just curious, how do you think art could be somehow used as a tool, a critical tool,
Mhm.
to reflect on that?
Mhm.
And then there is a second part of this question, uh,
Mhm.
that the question is like what we should be particularly like sensitive to, like what kind of this art-based research or art presence in this critical realm.
Mhm.
Uh, what should we what can be dangerous, let's say, or because I mean, let's think about art as a tool, or like as approach, so it can be like have this good and bad signs, let's say.
Mhm.
So yeah, that would be my like very wide, very general question.
Yeah. No, it's a really good question. I think, I like the way that how did you phrase it just a second ago? It was like the unthought thoughts from the future.
Yeah.
Um, because I think one way that I've been trying to think about, you know, the function of art, and I appreciate the fact that what is the use of it, right? I think that we're in a field that can sometimes, and probably all fields do this, they take it kind of for granted what their
Mm,
purposefulness was and assume that that's a kind of eternal purpose.
mhm,
And I think it's important to continually, in a way, when I say defend the field of art, I don't mean against like the cuts from the right wing government. Those are coming from a very difficult thing, or from a very different set of reasons. What I mean is that we continually have to, justify these kind of purposefulness, right? Like a kind of 18th century romantic purposefulness of art is maybe not the way
mhm.
it functions today in society, right? And so what do
Hopefully.
but a lot of, I think
Yeah.
if you actually look at it, there's a lot coming from that period. But that's to say that, so I think the sort of meta argument is in one way that every creation of a work is also, in a sense, a sort of implicit meta commentary on the field of art itself, like what it's doing, what it ought to be. And I think looking at in terms of its functions, what does it do? Or what can it do? And one affordance for us certainly is that we don't really have a lot of disciplinary fidelity, which is a real luxury, right? We can go around to all these fields, we can pick and merge and collage a bunch of different sets of knowledges or thoughts or perspectives into something different, some kind of monster in a way. But the way that I've been thinking about a lot lately is to think about art as like the function of art as a kind of modeling practice, right? And by that I don't mean like a modeling practice. So, but that I don't mean like making literal models, right? Or 3D models or something. But like the problem is in order to think something that's unthought, right? You need a world within which it's possible to think the unthought. And so in this way, like the exhibition or the artwork or whatever could be understood as a model world within which it's possible to think those thoughts that have not been thought before, right? And what I mean by that is I think because it's always about, these really compelling works of art, and that's very difficult to achieve. Probably most of the artwork we see doesn't do that. And that's fine. I think it's an incredible challenge to do that. And I say that as a, let's say, delinquent artist who doesn't make much work anymore, thinks about it too much. But in terms of like what sort of sensitivities are required in order to think something that was unthought, right? Because we're so conditioned to think within certain frames of reference that are familiar to us. And we evaluate things based on a certain set of base criteria, often that we're not even quite aware of, right? The given, what is just given to us. And so what if an exhibition or an artwork can be conceived as a kind of model world that is provoking sensitivity in a different way, such that it enables the thinking of thoughts? And in that way, I think it's also interesting as well, because it also, I think to me, this feels like more of an epistemological claim can be made from the field of art, more so than just knowledge production, which was always a sort of contested term. And it also takes away that strict division that, like, a figure like Deleuze had about, philosophers make concepts and artists make precepts or something. And it's like, well, maybe we need these different perceptual resensitizations that are achievable through works of art in order to generate those concepts, right? And there's a lot of really interesting work on this idea of models as vehicles for thinking outside of these kind of familiar coordinates of givenness, from within the sciences as well, right? Like that there's always this need to kind of externalize something in order to produce a condition of interaction such that you can enter the logic of the world of that thing, of that model world that you're externalizing. And in that way, technology is part of that, right? Like certainly with AI, on a philosophical level, basically the history of AI is the history of how humans have thought intelligence to be, right? Like at one point, early AI is just like load up a machine with a bunch of facts and then it will like concatenate, do it. And that's our model of our mind or intelligence, and it's only human. And that's radically changed over time. And now when you have these kind of AI systems emerging, at least philosophically, I'm not like some kind of AI fetishist or something, like as a context sense of thing, but as a philosophical issue, it's really helped that externalization of what intelligence could be has produced the effect that we've now exploded this category of intelligence such that it is no longer understood as strictly a human thing, right? We've got animal intelligence studies, we've got like plant intelligence studies, we've got machinic, and a lot of that is due to the fact of like producing those externalizations as a kind of model that we can interact with, and that enables those rigid categories to kind of like have a different possibility. So I like to think about artworks in that similar vein of like providing that model space that you can enter, and you enter a different world of that conditions sensibility or sensitivity otherwise. And because of that reconditioning, certain thoughts become available to you that were not thinkable.
I mean, I love how you think, or you're talking about sensibilities as a kind of like quality, because it's something that's so difficult to catch, and it's something that's like it's not so often present in the theory or in the writings. It's something that's very personal. But once you know someone has like special sensitivity or sensibility, you know it. I mean, somehow, you have to feel that, and you apply this very human, very non-transferable to data, like qualities. And this is, and then also like I was thinking about a lot during my project, recent project, that I was working not with the artists but with their sensibilities, which also reflects to their worldview and etc. So I love that you have similar approach. I feel so seen, so great. And I also love this comment. I mean, the history of like human intelligence that is kind of transformed is like somehow external intelligence. I feel that's the history of mediation, new remediation, and externalization. So externalization, mediation, and this kind of like ping pong going on, that we can see. There's this like artwork. I'm sitting in the room by this sound artist. I forgot his name. I mean, there's
Alvin Lucier.
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
And so there's like this one sentence, right? That is like remediated and distorted by this its remediation. So if you're like more far away from the center, you're not able to. There's less probability that you're able to understand the meaning of that sentence. But in a way, it's the same sentence, right?
Yeah,
So,
it's so funny you mentioned that, because I'm not the only one sort of working on these problems or thinking these things, or having conversations with friends and colleagues. And I made a video a few years ago with a brilliant noise composer and philosopher, J.P. Caron, based in Brazil. And it was in a context of a sound event, and we started with that, with a kind of sample of the Lucier. You are like sitting in a room, because our argument was like, you're not just sitting in a room, you're sitting in a world that is dependent upon the training of an organ of sense, right? And so how do artworks in effect participate in the retraining of sense, or those organs of sense, if you want, in order to stimulate sensitivity otherwise? And if you put it in, let's say, less, I guess, artistic, or even sort of, that sounds a bit mystical even, but like, if we think about sensitivity to information today, mostly that gets translated in our economically dominated condition, into kind of price or something, right? Like, so devices or sensitivity to information that is circulating gets translated into a price, which is a very specific type of sensitivity to particular types of information. So what would it mean to be sensitive to other types of information? What organs are required in order to interface with those different sensitivities? And so that's where I think like art can do more of that. Again, I'm not a huge fan of the disruptive thing, but the improbable, that labor of the improbable, if you want, in order to help do that work of unsettling, right? Because I think a lot of we're all sort of like running around with these, with a very strong sense of like what is given, and very often we have to unsettle those things in order to enable the possibility to think something other.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it shows how it's like it's just a good piece of art if it is useful again in so many contexts. And so congrats.
I didn't. I mean, I hope to make such an artwork one day. I have not.
Yeah,
But I think
and
I think it's really important that we keep those conversations going, though, right? And not take the field for granted, and be willing to do that updating work of like, well, what is some kind of purposefulness of art in
yeah,
this context? How do we, without seeking a kind of finite definition that this is the purpose, but how does our process of making or curating or engaging with art implicitly endorse a certain, function of it within our reality, right? Without going into that overinflation of like, these massive statements about, oh, this art pushes the boundaries of blah, blah, blah. Like,
yeah.
I think everyone's sort of tired of this, of these like
I mean,
hyper.
I'm tired of that. I mean,
No,
at
so
least.
it's like, let's be a little bit more, what can it do? And but let's be ambitious, but like also a bit humble about what it's actually doing.
Yeah, I like ambitious and humble. That's a great approach. I mean, once we are going towards the grande finale of our conversation, I mean, time flies, if you're having fun. Um, I would like to somehow like depart from this maybe not dark but critical atmosphere
Mhm.
and ask you the most difficult question that I could ask ever. So I would like to ask about your somehow like dream utopian model of way of functioning between like what's technological, what's organic, what's societal, what's cultural. Like if you could give us this like beautiful the image of the perfect or dream world
I
or
will not.
model. Yeah,
I will not do that.
yeah.
But I will say no. And I mean, if I was really wanted to dodge the question, I'd fake a glitch and then just hang up.
Mhm.
I won't do that either.
Okay, thank you.
No, no, I'll just be like frozen. No, I mean, I guess, I'm more kind of cautious in a way, I mean,
Mhm.
I definitely have a kind of telos in mind of a kind of eco-socialist, you know, thrust, if you want,
Mhm.
towards how, but there's not like a kind of singular model or like of how I imagine that to be. And I'm actually quite fearful of or fearful would be the wrong word, hesitant to go into replay that game of uh designing some kind of scenario as a kind of endpoint and then going there. I feel that there's so much contingency and turbulence and uncertainty in the world at the moment. And of course, this has to do with a lot of the difficulties in actually predicting the sort of like climate catastrophe for one thing. I mean, these are all sort of, a lot of these predictions are skewing and they're off, and it turns out they're not so predictable. So I'm hesitant about that, like reenacting that modernist, like let's make a plan and let's go there sort of
Mhm.
thing. I think we need to definitely rethink. I mean, yeah, I think maybe I'll stay in that dark space or not in the dark space, but let's say identify
Yeah,
certain
but then
problems.
again, it's a ambitious and humble. I mean, yeah, you gave us the model, and then you're living by the model that you propose. So yeah, it consists.
Well, yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot of I think right now I feel like there's a general recognition of hitting the limits of the limits of the organizational model through which the world is hegemonically governed today.
Mhm.
Um, you know, um, but how this plays out in what a lot of people are talking about in terms of like a multipolar world, which could ultimately be, help challenge, let's say, US Anglo hegemonic or Western dominance or something like that. Like it could be a counterbalance, but it could also go horribly wrong. And it depends, like, you know, but certainly I think when I say we're coming up to the limits of you know, the way that the geopolitics is currently structured compared to the sets of problems that we face, these are really requiring a heavy, you know, intellectual, probably also technological investment in tools of governance, for example, right? I mean, simply the kind of structure of a nation state, uh, governing, you know, like, because nothing stays within those territorial boundaries, right? So those sorts of models for partitioning, let's say, are pretty inadequate for the challenges that we face. That said, there are also those terrifying scenarios of that like one world governance sort of thing that's not going. But we're certainly seeing a lot of failures in those kind of in that institutional realm. And so like I feel like this is a moment to really like ramp up those proposals of what those structures could be. One area that I've been, I mean, maybe it's a little bit intuitive at this point and not completely, it's not like fully researched or something, but it's just been a point of interest that I've noticed in, you know, reading into very different things from biosemiotics through to like models of geopolitical governance or something, is there seems to be, at least in the Western tradition, some sort of like, when I say revival, it's the wrong word, but re-examination of certain principles that were from the medieval period,
Mm-hmm.
like conceptually, like the history of thought in the
For
medieval
example?
period. For example, you know, in medieval period, you have city-states. You don't have countries, you have city-states,
Okay.
right? So like, what would a model of governance be that could handle a sort of threshold of locality and be accountable to that locality? Because in many cases, a structure of a nation state is far too large to be accountable to a quite localized, you know, human community, and not to mention non-human. So there are some discussions about like maybe that kind of reemergence of a city-state scaled thing and how those would enter into some sort of conglomerate for mutual accountability is one thing. What I learned from doing research in the summer in this like biosemiotic realm was again the way that certain historical epochs will block the possibility to pursue an idea further, right? Because I'm just like, oh, it completely doesn't make sense. So when you have the birth of modernity, it like blocks certain pathways of understanding science. So in one example, you have this theological thinker who was trying to understand the domain of signs, not as that they're separate from nature, but there's like both that they're part of the same sort of genus. So trying to understand basically a kind of pre-nature culture version of semiotics, right? Which is deeply fascinating because as soon as you get modernity, then basically signs equal symbols equal human language, and that's that, right? And now we're of course re-understanding that this is a deeply impoverished picture of science and sign making practices, meaning making practices, and so on. So I'm just saying that there seems to be, at least in these few examples that have just, you know, maybe it's coincidental, but come across that there's an interesting way to relook at certain ideas that were germinating and not fully fleshed out. And it's not like a return again to a medieval. That's not the point. But what were some kernels of ideas that maybe happened at different moments that are worth re-examining through a different referential framework that we now find ourselves in, right? This kind of planetary framework. And so that seems to me quite interesting. And I like the time travel as well, that there's these like little like embryonic ideas that pre-exist. So you don't have to like invent something brand new. You kind of do away with this obsession of a new idea, but nonetheless, you take it on a different pathway and you kind of do that work of unblocking the the potential that idea could have had that maybe actually makes sense in this moment, obviously in different conditions and with massive updates, but nonetheless, you know, there's these kernels of ideas that are already existing. And I'm saying this only from the very limited example of a couple of items from within the Western canon. Imagine mapping that to the history of human thought at large, where we get lots of kernels of ideas that could be worth sort of pursuing and thinking through and redoing that like context sensitivity in our historical present, basically.
Yeah, I mean that's somehow maybe ironical sustainability are sustainable. I mean, just using the thought from the past that was like thought, but not kind not present or something like that. I mean, I'm like maybe too poetic right now, but this is the way I'm trying to perceive the world through poetry. Why not? I'm looking. Once again, sorry.
It's an important vehicle, poetry, you know?
Yes, of course. That's my, literary studies are talking through me. I don't see any questions or comments. I mean, so I will ask the question if I may.
Sure.
Because I'm enjoying this conversation very much. I would like to ask you as well. I mean, because we were talking about time, about this like history, the recent and the not so recent one. But I know you're now working on the project that about the space, let's say, more. And could we discuss it a little bit? Could you give us like sneak peek of the thing that you're working on right now?
Sure, sure. I mean, I need to get cracking on it a little bit more rigorously.
Mm-hmm.
Quite demanding with school-related duties, all very enjoyable, but yeah, I need to get the space of focus. But yeah, so that basically it's about it's the working title is Figuring Planetary Space, and the sort of main idea behind it is to say that it's very much drawing on the work of Sylvia Wynter,
Mm-hmm.
an incredible philosopher, still alive, quite old now. But she invented this idea of the genre of being human as a kind of a main reference, or a way that humans idealize this kind of, or the way that the human society has created an idealized version, an archetype, if you want, of an idealized human. And that serves as a kind of primary frame of reference for social structures. And for her, like all human cultures do this. But what happens in modernity is, of course, this figure. And when I mean modernity, I'm talking about long Euro modernity. So let's say early Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
So there you have this invention of a genre of being human who's like de-godded and is masterfully rational over nature, etc. You know, this is basically philosophical humanism that gets inflated to the status of representing all of humanity or something like that, right? And I mean, I'm quite compelled and interested in, and of course, this leaves a very this kind of figure of, or this archetype of the human is, that becomes a colonizer and basically is the I'm putting it in a very simplified way here for brevity, but
Yeah, of course.
basically is the driver, is the conceptual driver for the sort of path that we find ourselves now in, right? But what was interesting for me, in tying it back to the technology, was like Winter's got this incredible model of these kind of things with the historical analysis and so on. But there's very little discussion about technology or artistic correspondences that are going on at the time. And so part of the project was to say, well, it's not like we just invent a genre of being human. And I'm like, hey, Aleksandra, this is the new Vitruvian man. And you're like, wow, cool. Okay, I'm gonna perform that into being, right? It's like we need to be able to understand that new figure, right? So at the time, a humanist human would have been, unthinkable. If you're beholden to God, it would have been like really difficult to think. So like, what are the modes of externalization that allow people to see themselves in these kind of concepts and then begin to operationalize them, right? And the technology, again, it does that mimetic work. So the main argument is to say that like, well, we have while we have this emergence of this humanist figure of man, we also have the emergence of a very specific type of space that is very different from space of medieval Europe, namely classical perspectivalism, that provides a space of projection for this concept to exist, to kind of situate itself, right? And then so the main idea is to say that, well, if that's true, then we can say that like not only are historical epochs conditioned by a certain set of discursive proclivities, but they also have spatial representational proclivities as well. So if we are seriously to try to, exit this kind of paradigm of a long Euromodernity come globalization, and really think about the planetary as a constitutively different historical epoch, what are the spatial conditions through which we could understand ourselves, right? And so the sort of working hypothesis at the moment is that we would be moving from a space of projection of from the modern period, which is like also qualified by a space that is tailored and adjusted to human proportions, to a paradigm of embeddedness, right, in a multi-scalar framework. And that's where we can also start looking at certain more recent histories of geometry, where there's a much more higher dimensional spatial complexity afforded to it. It allows for nesting, but the main sort of difference is that we don't take space as such for granted, right? In this other version, in the historical version, space is a given. Therefore, you just plot your points, and it's always kind of uniform. Whereas now we're talking about different species of space, to borrow a term from a colleague, Anil Bawakabia. But it's just to say that space is not given in the first instance. So that itself needs to be constructed. And how would that transform human self-understanding in this kind of nested higher dimensional space? And what can some of these more recent geometrical models that are very counterintuitive to our phenomenological experience, how can those help inform this different type of spatial reality that we may be living in, whereby I think the borders of what we conventionally understand as local are deeply troubled, and they're not eradicated, but they're not self-evident.
Not so evident. Yeah. Looking forward to results, let's say, of this project. I mean, it sounds fascinating. I mean, how we can redefine everything that we're living in, right? And everything that seems so obvious and present and non-possible to redefine. Let's say, let's redefine what seems to be impossible to redefine. Let's say. So that would be my motto, or for this conversation. Thank you so much for your time and for your presence. I hope everyone enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. And thank you.
Thanks for hosting, and thanks for. I also appreciated the conversation, so thank you.
Thank you, and see you somewhere in the future.
Absolutely.
Or in the space, or in this like entanglement of time and space. Thank you. I think now we should just